Tell me, friends, what's the most important thing in a game of chess? Obviously, winning the game. That's the ultimate goal of every match. In the end, 1,000 things can happen, but what matters to us is finishing the game with a win. And a lot of times, we make things more complicated than they need to be. Today, in this video, we're going to learn a ton. Why? Let me give you some context again. Do you remember a few days ago when I told you I was playing in a really tough tournament? Well, I showed you a loss, which you loved because we learned a ton from it. However, today, of course, we're going to take a detailed look at a win, not just because I won, but because we're going to see the specific strategic path that I took to get there and extract some valuable lessons from it, as always, so we can use them in our own future competitive games. I was playing with the black pieces, and my opponent had a little more elo than I did, just to give you some perspective. He was also older than me. I didn't like playing against child prodigies. You know that in this tournament there were a lot of child prodigies, and luckily, right? I actually prefer playing against people who are a bit more experienced, because these young kids really scare me. So I started with knight to f6. You know that against the queen's pawn we have several possible responses, right? Knight to f6 is the most popular of all, because it gives us a range of options, depending on what our opponent does. For example, they might play the queen's gambit, even if we haven't played d5. They can delay it, right? They could also play, I don't know, bishop to f4, a London system, or a Kali system with e3. Who knows, right? My opponent played c4, and I chose the King's Indian defense line. We've covered it on the channel, you all love it, and of course, I use it in my own games. It's an extremely aggressive defense that can lead us to a good outcome. Knight to c3, my opponent keeps developing pieces, and since they haven't played the pawn to e4 yet, I play bishop to g7. Very important. Why do I mention the pawn to e4? Because it's crucial to know that when your opponent's pawn finally lands on e4, like it just did right now, we should play d6. This is extremely important because we're preventing our opponent's pawn from coming to attack our knight, you see? With this e5. Just teacher, a very basic question. Here, even if I play d6 first, can't he still play e5 anyway? It's true that now I could capture it, but he could simply recapture with his pawn and would still be attacking my knight. This wouldn't be possible, because then, after the queen exchanges, queen takes queen and then king takes queen, we would simply make a discovered attack on this pawn with this move here, knight to g4. And as you can see, not only do we get this pawn back, but we're also putting tremendous pressure on the f2 square, giving check and taking the rook. So the white pieces would end up in a slightly unfavorable position. That's why this d6 move completely prevents, let me put this back as it was, this d6 completely prevents the opponent's e5 threats. And hey, if they do play e5, that's even better for us, because we're going to play this variation. Here, the main options for the white pieces are, among the most popular, knight to f3, even f3, the Samish variation to try to castle long, or an interesting line that my opponent played against me, knight from g to e2. I had already seen that my opponent had played this variation before, so I prepared a line for it, okay? As we already know, on this channel we really like to prepare these lines so we're ready for our games, especially against this knight from g to e2. What's the idea behind this knight from g to e2? That when we castle, they want to develop it through g3. Well, that's an interesting line, right? It's a pretty uncommon line, because usually this knight doesn't go out that way. But anyway, who knows? Now it clears the way for the f3 pawn. It also over-defends the d4 pawn really well, in case at some point it needs extra protection, right? Or maybe, it wants to be a bit prophylactic against possible attacks on that square, you know? But my idea, I had already seen that line, is that now I was going to play h5 first. This is a strategic move you could always go for in situations where your opponent's knights are both of them positioned on their own specific file. That simply means they're placed on the ninth file. If this knight, for example, is here at some point, I recommend going with the side pawn, in this case the A pawn, to attack it. And if the other knight, for example, is on the G3 square, I also recommend going with the H pawn to attack it. And what's the idea? Well, the idea is simple. If they don't do anything to stop it, I want to push that pawn one more square, so that the knight will have to retreat and I'll be gaining space while they've wasted time moving the knight. However, here the most common response in what my opponent did is to stop the pawn's advance. But by stopping this advance, I have a strong pawn chain here on the king side, and my opponent is left with some pretty weak squares that I'll be able to take advantage of with my pieces thanks to that pawn having advanced too far. At this point, many of you might be thinking that the theoretical move here could be e5 or knight from b to d7. These would probably be the most logical moves, right? Maybe putting pressure with the bishop, although they could play e3 against us, but that's not the most accurate. Playing e5 at this point, while not a terrible move, would give white a good space advantage with this d5. Now, we could continue, for example, with knight to a6 or knight to d7 with the same goal, to get one of the black knights to land on the c5 square. Well, it's an interesting line, right? But white would be comfortable here as well. A much trickier variation that I already knew, okay? Because I had looked it up before playing this game, is this knight to c6? This move is definitely much more precise. Although it might seem strange because we're basically putting ourselves right in front of 5 so they can play it and kick out our knight, this would actually be very good for us because we could move the knight to e5 and it wouldn't be easy to drive it out later on. Playing f4 would actually be really dangerous because now they would be leaving that square open for us forever and that knight would never be able to be kicked out. At most, they might be able to trade a piece for that knight, for example, the bishop, but then it would be our other knight, or the bishop, which still hasn't moved, that would take over that strong square, and of course, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. That's why, yes, d5 is an option, but it doesn't really worry us, okay? Because whenever pawns advance too far, this is something we need to remember, they leave weak squares behind, alright? Like I always tell you, right? Even though I'm not the best player in the world, not by a long shot, in fact, I'm a pretty average player, I love sharing with you all my experiences and everything I'm thinking during the game, because no one knows better than me exactly what was going through my mind at that moment. And that's why we all benefit from the thoughts behind a game, whether I win or lose. What's important is the whole process during the games. Alright, the idea here is that my opponent, instead of playing d5, which, as I just said, is a double-edged move, right? He played bishop to e2. Without a doubt, that's a much more logical move. I'd say it's the best move for white. It develops a minor piece, also prepares castling, and of course it doesn't get in the way, for example on d3, the queen's defense of the d4 square, and so without a doubt, we could win a pawn right away, couldn't we? That's why this bishop to e2 seems like the most sensible move to me. And my response, obviously, was the following, e5. Yes, all of this up to this point, let's say, I had it well figured out, you know? I had studied this at home, so to speak. Why? Because, since I had seen that this player had played exactly this in other lines, maybe not in this exact order, but something very similar, I had seen that he would go for this King's Indian system. At this point, I thought he would now play d5, because my knight doesn't have the d5 square available, right? Just like we mentioned earlier. However, my idea was to place my knight on d4, where it would be excellently positioned. It's not easy to drive it out, and if at some point it does get pushed out, who knows if even capturing with the pawn or playing c5 would be a good thing, since this bishop will always be defending the d4 square from a distance. And also, if things go badly, let's say, I can always exchange this knight for the bishop. To my surprise, friends, my opponent didn't advance, but instead captured my pawn. Well, this is very good news. Why? Because this is where my preparation ended. I love this. Obviously, being prepared for a game is excellent, right? But when we start thinking for ourselves, that's really when the chess game begins, isn't it? So here I was thinking, what do I prefer? To capture with the knight or with the pawn? The answer is obvious. I prefer to capture with the pawn. And I'm going to explain why, because you can apply this rule in your own games. Whenever we can place a pawn on one of the 4 central squares, we should do it. Nimzovich used to say that this, for example, capturing with the knight instead of the pawn would be categorized, sorry, that's a tricky word, as abandoning the center. Whenever we can capture with a pawn and bring it to the center, and we don't, for example, if we capture with a knight instead, we're abandoning the center, and at that point, our opponent would have superior control of the game, because whoever controls the center usually controls the game. That's why after pawn takes pawn, I want to capture with the pawn. D takes x5. The idea is that now, it's true, they can trade queens with me, but I'm not worried about trading queens because my pieces are well positioned. Imagine that now they play queen takes d8, I'll simply continue with rook takes d8. The file's mine, and not only that, notice one thing. Their pawns are badly placed. It's true that this resembles a Meraki structure, especially when a knight ends up on d4. When we have pawn, knight, pawn, that's a Meraki structure. A very interesting structure. However, they're very far from achieving that. Why? It's because my pawn, thanks to being in the center, controls the d4 square. A knight will never be able to land there. And not only that, but also, since these pawns are separated and pushed too far forward, they leave an ideal square for my knight, where I could place it in an advanced outpost. And notice that just by having the knight on g3 instead of f3, sorry, I moved the camera a bit. If it were on f3, it would be controlling this square, but since it's on g3, it doesn't control it. So my plans to place a knight on d4 are starting to look very solid. You see it, right? It's true that they might be able to prevent it with a bishop to e3, but be careful because that bishop wouldn't be very safe there either, since we also have the g4 square to chase it away with the knight. Do you understand the difference between white's position and black's position? At this moment, even though it looks like a completely equal position, my control over the squares is much stronger than the control of the white pieces. This knight can't do anything at all because the g-pawn is directly blocking it, fanning it away, so it can't jump. And although it's true that white's knight can land on the d5 square, it doesn't have the same power as my knight, because it's true that I could attack it directly with my knight and even with my bishop on e6. Still, it's a good square, though not as powerful as the d4 square. My opponent didn't trade queens with me, but instead played bishop to g5, and I realized that here I had 2 options, right? The first would be to just go ahead and play this, right? And put my knight on a strong square, or trade queens, and continue with, let's see, how can I explain it so you really get it? I would say that since my pieces have better squares than his, if we trade queens, I'll have a slight advantage, because my pieces will operate, let's say, in a better way, right? Jumping in with the knight right away is possible. However, pay attention, because at some point he might trade this bishop for this knight, and then the knight remains on d4. It would take on, let's say, greater importance, right? So my idea was exactly what I told you, to trade queens. Even though now I'm temporarily giving up the open file to my opponent's rook, I already know that file is going to be closed, either by my knight or by his, right? So here, at this moment, I already know what my opponent wants to play against me. Pay attention. What he wants to play against me is bishop takes knight on d4, threatening my bishop and threatening my c7 pawn, and my bishop would have to retreat to the d8 square from where it would defend the c7 point. If you didn't understand that, you can rewind the video, there's no problem. You can even play through the game on a board next to you, right? It's really good, for example, to put these videos on the TV and also go over them with your own board. That way, you'll remember much more than just by watching. Hey, chess teacher, just by watching it, I already get it, so there's no problem at all. You can simply watch it once, twice, 3 times, as many times as you need and learn from these games, right? Alright, so here, what was my idea? Instead of jumping straight in with the knight to avoid these kinds of situations, I first played bishop to e6, okay? To protect this knight jump a bit more, which you can still play anyway, and my opponent did, what I want is to give up my pair of bishops. Because now, it's true that I've given up my pair of bishops, but my knight on d4 is going to be an absolute monster. It's not going to be easy to get rid of it, not by a long shot. Here, my opponent definitely has two options, to capture with the ka pawn or to capture with the d pawn. Both are interesting. In my opinion, the best option is definitely to capture with the ka pawn line, because then you give the white pieces an open line of attack. And it's this ka pawn. The rook can be placed on this semi-open file and directly attack this blocked pawn, because it can't advance since the d-pawn is defending it. Besides, this pawn structure seems solid to me. My opponent, looking for some imbalance, captured with the pawn. Later, when discussing the game with my opponent, he explained to me that he wanted to eventually capture this knight and place his own knight, which was practically dead on g3, on the e4 square, where it would have much more activity. However, from this point on, I'm not going to let him carry out these plans so easily. There's no doubt that now, if my knight is being attacked, I'm going to move it to this square. My goal is to capture this bishop. Not at the moment. Who knows if I'll capture it in the future? Because remember one thing, we just gave up our pair of bishops. In an endgame where everything opens up, let's say, and these pawn structures break and there are open lines, my opponent will have an advantage, the pair of bishops. And this is very easy to understand. A bishop can only control half the squares on the board, the dark squares, right? And the other bishop, the other half. If you have both, thanks to your bishops, you control all the squares on the board. That's why whoever has the pair of bishops when the opponent doesn't, well, they have that little advantage, okay? Small or not so small, it depends on how you see it and what position you're in. However, I gave it up, let's say, knowingly, right? Let's say, knowing that this knight would become very strong for me, and that at some point, I would be able to get one of those two bishops back. For now, my opponent doesn't want to make it easy for me and places the bishop on d3. That makes perfect sense. Here, several options came to my mind. Do you know what my main option was? To play c6. It might seem risky because we're letting the passed pawn get close to queening, but this would actually be a bad move by my opponent, because I can simply capture this pawn easily. It won't be easy to defend it. Who knows? Maybe at some point I can do this so you can never defend it again. Although here, I'd probably already have much more interesting moves than c5, like blocking with knight to d7. Just imagine that, right? So they can't come to defend it, and then later I can capture it with the knight, with the rook, and then the bishop. Who knows, right? But this pawn would be completely dead. That's why with this Clon 6, I would already manage to capture this possible, let's say, this potential passed pawn, you see? Because it's a 2 against 1. You get it, right? Since my d-pawn has advanced too far. I didn't play c6, even though it seemed like a very good move to me. In fact, on my notes, I also wrote down c6 as another option, but I played rook from f to e8. And this has a simple plan. Obviously, what I want is to advance the pawn, right? But my opponent isn't going to let me do that so easily, because if I advance the pawn, I might even win a piece, right? Or if not, at least get very strong control. Why? Because the king is behind. If at any point we make exchanges, then I play f5 with the piece pinned, right? You already know that when we have a pinned piece, the most important thing is to threaten it with a pawn. Well, if you don't really understand pins, I recommend you review the lessons we have on pins inside the academy, okay? I'll leave it for you right down here in the description. And by the way, these days we're adding a completely new course that's included for everyone who's in, on top of the more than 40 classes already uploaded and more that will be added week after week. You can join with everything included, even the ChessMine app, all for just €1 or $1 right now. Alright, 7 days of trial for just €1 or $1 so you can see for yourself if you're improving or not. I assure you that your ELO is going to go up a lot because everyone who's joined the academy, or at least everyone I've spoken to personally or by email, alright? You've told me that you've noticed a very, very significant improvement. Very good. So what should my opponent do? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Get out of these pins, and the most logical thing, no doubt, is to castle. And I, knowing they were going to castle, that's why I played rook to e8, because my thinking went one step further. My thought was, I play rook to e8, they're going to castle, and once they do, I'm going to bring in this knight to h7. Pay close attention to this. I'm going to win back the pair of bishops again, that is, I'm going to recover it. Look, chess teacher, don't try to fool me. Because this bishop is being attacked, all I have to do is move it away. It's not that simple. And my plan was the following. Remember, rook to e8, castle, knight to h7. For what? Because if you move the bishop away, I'll play bishop to f6, and I'm going to win this pawn. Do you see this pawn that's not protected? There's no way to defend it. So after knight to h7, my opponent doesn't have it so easy to move the bishop away. Let's say if bishop to d3, for example, bishop to e3, let's say, bishop to f6, and I win your h4 pawn. Do you see it? There's no way to defend it. That's why my opponent here, after thinking for a while, came to the conclusion that the best idea, okay, was not to move the bishop away and played knight to e4. In my opinion, friends, this was the mistake that, let's say, allowed me to keep pressing until the end of the game. This, for me, is the mistake. You can analyze the game yourselves and try to figure out if this is a mistake for you or not, okay? Obviously, you can check it with the engines. The engines say it's not a correct move. There were better ones. For those who are more curious, a better move would have been to leave the bishop where it was and, for example, bring the rook from f to e1, and we would have continued with a pretty balanced position. But this gives me the ability to expand my position with confidence while steadily gaining more tempo. f5, an excellent move in my opinion. Alright friends, why? Because I force him to retreat the knight. Obviously, he can't jump here because it's well defended, so he has to move either to c5 or c3. c5 didn't seem like the best idea to me because, for example, here I could even win a pawn. For example, I press with b6, the knight has to move, exchanges happen, and then a discovered attack with e4 threatening the bishop and the b3 pawn. You can't defend both at the same time. That's why knight to c3 seemed more sensible to me, which is what my opponent did. However, at this point, I feel quite superior. What was my plan? First, to exchange knight for bishop. I just regained the bishop pair. That is, the only idea my opponent had was to keep that bishop pair to have some small advantage, but now that's gone. However, this position's very strong for me. Look at how I attack and trap this bishop, which has no other square to retreat to except b1. Many of you might say, well, there's also the e2 square. Yes, but that bishop would end up extremely passive. I'm not even going to exchange it for the knight, you know? Although, if I don't know how to continue, I could just take bishop for knight, knight takes, and then I take the b-pawn. Then it's true that the rook could come and capture here, right? But that would already be a good continuation for me, I'd say. However, it's better to keep this bishop, right? Bishop to b1, and who knows if it can be recycled. What's my goal? To make sure that bishop can't be recycled. Compare my pieces, friend. Who's better off? Well, for now, I'd say me, for several reasons. First, we're even in material, but you have a pawn that I'm almost certain I'm going to take. Do you see it? Because it's all alone, right? On the other hand, I'd say the king's safety is pretty much the same. Even though it might look like the white king is safer, that's not true, because there aren't any pieces that can come attack my king, and this king is going to be completely safe. There are no queens on the board. In fact, my king is actually a bit better off because it can join the game real easily. If we compare the rooks, for now they're very similar, that's true. If we compare the knights, my knight is infinitely better, and don't even get me started on the bishop. My bishop is a beast, while my opponents can't even get out. So my assessment in that game is that I had the advantage. Does that make sense? And how do you continue? Well, here I had several ideas, maybe c6, but it seemed to me that the most direct was to play e3. What am I threatening? I'm threatening e2. So you pretty much have to capture, right? And when you capture and I recapture with the rook, my idea, and that's why I played the c3, is that these two pawns end up isolated and doubled. You already know how important pawn structure is in the academy. You can learn a lot about that too. This rook, who knows, maybe it can come and capture. I have control of the only open file there is, and I'll be able to place my other rook there. You can see that at first my opponent was the one who had control of the file, but not anymore, right? And that's why I chose to go into this line. I'm going to end up in a position where this bishop can't do much. I have the better pieces, and on top of that, I'm going to win this pawn because there will be no way to defend it. Let me go a little further. Here comes a huge blunder when I get overconfident, friends. Not everything is roses. I'm telling you, I'm not a very strong player either. I'm not the best player in the world. My opponent plays rook to f4. Oh my goodness. I thought, all right, I'll play knight to e2, check, we trade, I control the file, rook on the 7th, and I do this. Guys, I made this move in 10 seconds. What was my surprise? That, when I made this move, I realized what I had just fallen for. Oh man, it was a really basic tactic, and I didn't see it at the time. It was really basic. Honestly, guys, right? Rook takes knight, and when they take me, knight to e2. Switching the order would have been much better, because then I get the rook back and win the knight. A really simple tactic that, because I was thinking quickly, feeling confident, thinking I was ahead, I just played this knight to 2 right away, and as soon as I moved it, I thought, oh man, Chestershire, look what you just fell for. We're human, guys, it's okay. I'm still ahead, but winning would have been much easier, right? Winning the piece would have basically meant victory right then and there. It's okay, we're human. In chess, we all make mistakes. Even Magnus Carlsen, right? But honestly, this one was really easy to spot, wasn't it? Let me know in the comments if something like this has ever happened to you. Come on, I'm going to read all your comments. Have you ever blundered something and the moment you move, you say, oh my gosh, I had such a great move right here? Does this ever happen to you? Because for me, this probably isn't the only time it's happened, right? Here, I saw this line where things were looking really good, Rook on the 7th, looking really good. Now my opponent has to play b3. I'm going to bring in the other rook, and that's what happened in the game, right? I'm in a great position. But still, there was something even better, no doubt about it, right? The idea is that my opponent played rook to f2 here to trade pieces. Go ahead and trade if you want, I'll just bring in the other one. I stick to my plan. Bishop to f8, then bishop to e7 to take your pawn and go into an endgame with an extra pawn. King to f1, now my rook is threatened, so now I trade and play bishop to e7. I'm going to take this pawn. It's true that you can pin my bishop, and that's what happened in the game, but I figured that here I just check you, you have to move, I trade rooks, and again, bishop to e7, and I win your pawn, right? Careful, okay? This is double-edged, because of course I'm going into a bishop endgame with opposite colors, but with an extra pawn. This is interesting, because a bishop endgame with opposite colors is very likely to end in a draw. You should know this, my friends, no matter how much of an extra pawn we have. However, I considered the following. I'm going to have this 4 versus 3 well under control, and this 3 versus 1, once I take this pawn, honestly, you're going to have a really hard time defending yourself. I'm showing you this because you're going to love it. The king comes over here. Obviously, going to defend that pawn doesn't make sense. Before I take that pawn, I prevent any possible advances, right? Because when I move with the bishop, they'll be able to defend, but right now I have it under control, and first I play b6. I got all the time in the world, right? Sorry, first I played b6, and then the king came here. Well, I got the move order mixed up. Now, yes, I capture this pawn before it's too late. My opponent tries to push forward. I go back with bishop to e7 to keep everything under control. There's no rush. I bring my king in. Notice how this endgame is won? Because it takes a lot of technique. He brought his king in, and for now I advance my pawns a bit. Here, I don't want to capture, even though it might be possible, because if I do, at some point he could get in with his king, and these pawns would be very weak. So I'm going to let you take my pawn, and then I'll recapture. And now you'll see how, because the order is also very important. I advance my, let's say, main pawn majority, because that's the one I want to use to promote, right? For now, I want to defend here and attack over there. Before king to f6, I'll go through this part of it faster, and now they capture this pawn of mine. Key moment. How would you capture with the QP or the KP? It's important to capture with the KP, because if you capture with the QP, they can create a passed pawn and cause you problems. We capture with the KP. These two against these two are completely locked, and we're going to control this one well. My opponent didn't want any trouble, and told me he wanted to block this flank to try to defend the promotion with his king and bishop. It makes sense, but my advantage is just too much, and you won't be able to defend, even if you have bishops of opposite colors. And I'm going to show you how I did it with a technique that, in my opinion, is correct. Bishop to d3. I simply keep advancing with g5. The bishop comes over here, and I improve my king. And what's my plan? Because obviously here, what my opponent wants is to defend with the king and bishop so that I can't advance, right? It's clear that I have to promote a pawn because with just the bishop, I won't be able to checkmate. So my opponent is going to defend, and my plan is to sneak in with my king, okay? Sneak in with my king up to here. And now, once I have everything cornered, f3 to cut off the bishop's defense. Pay attention, pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. And now the only move, friends, to try to defend is to bring the king over here. Because if not, I put the bishop here and no one is going to stop that pawn since the king can't get through and neither can the bishop. You see it? No one would be able to stop that pawn. That's why this is the only possible move, no matter what. My opponent sees it, but I still have good technique here. h4, bishop to d3, king to f4. Interesting, because I want to go around and come through here. Now you'll see why. The bishop is trying to defend these two pawns. Do you see it? It doesn't seem that simple. I want to advance. And the idea is that now he pins me, the pawn, so I can't advance it. But simply, pay attention to what I do. Check to force the king away and move him away from my pawn, the pawn I want to promote. And now, yes, I bring my king back. If you bring your king back, which is what happened, you lose. And if you don't bring your king back, simply what I'm going to do is this, advance the pawn. And that's why here you basically have to resign, because my plan is very simple. I'm going to do this and promote. So my opponent, with only a few seconds left on the clock, tried to come defend with the king, but this loses immediately. Alright, and I'm not going to tell you how I did it, because there's a completely winning move here. Let's see how many of you are able to spot it. Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading to see how many people get my move right, because after I played it, my opponent resigned, since you win the game immediately. I hope you love this, Bishop. If you want more of my games with commentary, leave me a big like. I said this Bishop. I meant this game. Leave me a big like. And of course, for all of you who really want to level up your chess by truly understanding the game and playing tournaments and everything, sign up for the Academy, which is right down here in the description. And you get 7 days for just €1 or $1. It's worth it. I'll be with you throughout the process. I hope you loved it, and as always, friends, I'll see you tomorrow in the next video. Goodbye.